Hey guys, this is part 2 of our Letters from Christopher discussion. We're starting at chapter 6, which goes into Nicole Kessinger, and then ending at chapter 11, which is the night/morning of the murders. I do want to say something really quick before we start. Last night, as I was already working on part 1 of this series, a friend of mine sent me a video that Jay for Justice posted. And in that video, the author of the book, Sherilyn Cadle, is exchanging texts with Jamie Watts. And in those texts, the author tells Jamie that the proceeds from this book are going to go to Chris to hire a defense attorney for an appeal. And then she further goes on to insult the Rusicks and calls them all kinds of names. Now, as those of us who were on the Letters from Christopher page are aware, it was said there that 10% of the proceeds from this book were going to go to a domestic violence shelter. And she didn't come out and name the charity, but that was stated. I can guarantee you that if these texts would have come out a month ago, most of us, including myself, would have not bought this book if we knew the whole story. So I just thought that needed to be said. And bottom line, guys, between all of the true crime community YouTubers that are doing videos on the book and talking about it and just discussing the content and the highlights of the stuff that is factually correct, I'm sure you can get everything you need to know. So just my opinion on this, but if you can, save yourself the $20 and just watch all of the videos of the YouTubers that you like, and I'm sure that you can get everything you need to out of it. So chapter 6 deals with Nicole Kessinger. I still cannot believe that after a year, there has not been one picture of her at all. That's just so crazy to me in 2019 that she's been able to stay out of sight that well. Anyway, they start out by talking about how Chris never told the FBI, but he again reiterates that as soon as Nicole told him that she wanted to give him a son, that she wanted to have these firsts, basically, I think you're supposed to read here that as soon as she started putting the screws in him, that he felt he had to make a choice. The plans to murder Shanann and the girls and their unborn baby were underway. He goes on to say, and again, this is Chris's perspective, so no way to verify this, but that at first Nicole told him that she never wanted kids. And then later, when the relationship escalated, she told him that she wanted to give him his first son. He goes on to say that as soon as the girls all left for North Carolina, he had this newfound sense of freedom. And then he again puts it on the other person and says that Nicole latched on very quickly to him and that she wanted him to stay with her every night. He says that Nicole had not yet included him in her friend circle, but was ready to right before the murders. And remember that it was August 9th when he took down his Facebook because he said he was afraid that Nicole's friends were going to see that Shanann was pregnant. He says that in the past, Nicole was in some abusive relationships. And so after that, she deleted most of her social media and then her mail went to her dad's place. And he also said that she took some meds. He didn't know what they were for, but he suspected that she had bipolar disorder. But we know from the February video interview with investigators that he didn't suspect her of having bipolar necessarily, but his attorneys told him that she made some videos about having bipolar disorder. He talks about the 2 times that Nicole was at his house, July 4th and July 14th. And he talks about, of course, on the July 14th visit, he had the day off work and he had spent the night over there. And when he woke up the next morning, Shanann had called a bunch of times and she was really pissed. And he went outside to talk to her and then he decided, that he needed to head home because Shanann was so mad. So Nicole was in the shower and he went in to tell her that, and she was mad because she kind of realized she didn't like the fact he was running home because Shanann was mad and realized that she wasn't number one in his life. And he basically said, we're not going to spend the day together anymore. And he left. And he says that she thought he was having second thoughts and she freaked out. So she ended up showing up at his home later that day and trying to say that she came over to help him set up this health app and go over his macros, which we've all talked about. And then on the second visit over there was on July 14th. And this is the one where they were headed home from the Shelby Museum. And they stopped at their house to eat before heading back. And apparently she was playing with Dieter, the family dog, and let her upstairs. And this is the story when she came downstairs after she had seen all of those pictures of Shanann and the girls and just how beautiful their house was. She just looked miserable. And so he led her to the couch and kind of tried to lay down with her and talk her down. This is when he said he had to talk her down off of a ledge. And she had kind of her first freak out, according to Chris. She said, what are you doing with me? Are you willing to give all this up? And she stormed out of the house and went and sat in her truck in his driveway. And they just texted back and forth for about 30 minutes. And he was able to calm her down and convince her to come back to the house. And he said that was kind of a turn on that he was able to do that. But it sounds to me like, kind of as it winds down, that he realized he couldn't keep this going. And that he basically, this is when she told him that she wanted to have first with him and she wanted to have his son. And this is when he decided that he was going to have to kill his family. So later that night, they went back to her place and they normally would have sex apparently 3 to 4 times a day. And they both commented that after that day, their sex life changed. The frequency went down, and also it was said that Chris was having trouble performing. So I guess there could be multiple reasons for that. He says that it was because of guilt. But I don't know. I mean, he had a lot going on in his mind and a lot of different things, and he's planning on killing his family. So I don't know if that had anything to do with it. But they do both mark that as a time that their sex life changed. Chapter 7 talks about when Chris went to North Carolina to meet up with Shanann and the girls. So it starts out by talking about how when Chris was at the airport leaving for North Carolina, Nicole sent him a text saying, "Take this time to fix the issues with your wife and enjoy time with your family." This gave him this warm feeling of no pressure, and he loved her even more for it. So this doesn't really sound like Nicole from what he's described or how she's sounded in the interviews. So, and you'll see as I go on that in this chapter that there's just conflicting messages here. So either she was giving him crazy mixed signals or he's relaying this inaccurately. It starts out by talking about a hot topic lately, which is the oxy. We have a whole nother video on that I suggest you go watch where we get a little bit deeper into it. But as it talks about in our other video, the first night, July 31st, Chris arrives in North Carolina, and then Shanann says that she has a really bad headache. So he offers to get her some medicine, and she thinks she's taking some over-the-counter pain relievers, and he actually slips her the 80 milligrams of oxycodone. Of course, this made Shanann really sick, and she was up vomiting most of the night, and Frankie Rusick goes into this in his interview in Discovery. He didn't help her, and from what we read, he was really detached. He didn't seem to care. Everyone thought that was so strange because that was very unlike Chris. And he says in the book that he was hoping that he gave her enough to miscarry. He talks to the author about while he was in North Carolina that they had made plans to have a little family vacation in Myrtle Beach. And if you remember, it was the girls' first time at the beach and they were really excited about it. And Shanann also thought it would give them an opportunity to talk about their relationship. And then he talks about the fact that for the first time he noticed that the girls were on his nerves. He didn't have any patience for them, and that it was really obvious to anyone around them that he was being really unfriendly and detached and aloof and just not acting like himself. But more importantly, it seems like he noticed that Bella and Celeste really didn't want to have anything to do with him. It was almost like they sensed that something was off with him. He said that they really didn't want to hold his hand or walk with him or play with him on the beach, which was out of the norm. He also goes into, while he was in North Carolina, Nicole was obviously trying to keep in touch with him. It sounds like she was very insecure about him being there with Shanann. She was, as we know, she was sending him all the nude pictures. And then she was also texting him like the first night when Shanann was sick. And he said, "Hey, we can't talk tonight." Nicole texted him, "Why not? Are you with her?" So he said that turned the pressure back on, and he decided to make Nicole happy that he would just completely ignore Shanann the rest of the trip and that he refused to be intimate with her. Chris talks about that when he gets back from Colorado, he goes to Nicole's, I believe that was August 8th, using his work truck. And this is interesting because this has never been talked about or released until this book. But on this day, Nicole gives him a key to her apartment. So if you'll remember in the interviews with investigators, they specifically asked her this and she flat out lied to them about it. After he left Nicole's, he had to hurry back so that he could make the ultrasound with Shanann. And then he openly talks about when he got there, he had almost a hatred for her and the baby. And as they were doing the ultrasound and he saw the new life, that he felt completely indifferent and cold towards Shanann and the baby. And he wouldn't even let it register in his mind that that was his son. And she tried to hold his hand during the ultrasound, and he just pulled away because he wanted no part of her or the baby. And this part makes me so sad for Shanann. Later that night, after the ultrasound, they got in a fight. She was asking him why he was being so cold, and she allegedly said to him, whatever's going on or whoever she is, know that you'll never see these kids again, so make sure that she's worth it. And with that, he slept on the couch that night so he could call Nicole, and the next night he slept in the basement. The next day was August 9th, and if you remember from Discovery, this was a big day. Shanann was trying to make amends with Chris's parents, so she sent them a picture of the ultrasound, trying to introduce them to their new grandson, and they did not respond to her. Nicole was starting to tell her friends about Chris and told him that, so Chris got nervous and deleted his Facebook because he was afraid that Nicole's friends were going to look Shanann up on Facebook and see that she was pregnant. This is also the day that he sent the doll pic, of course, at 11:45 in the morning to Shanann. Shanann noticed that he pulled his Facebook down, and this was another red flag to her, and it made her really nervous that something was going on. This is the day that she booked a couples weekend in the mountains for her and Chris, and she found someone to watch the girls so that she and Chris could go and try to reconnect and talk about their relationship. And this part of the book, I don't know, it just gave me the creeps reading it, even though we know what happens. But Chris agreed to go, but he tells the author that he agreed because he knew that she would be dead by that weekend and that he was never going to have to go on that trip. It talks about how Shanann had thought about canceling the trip to Arizona with Thrive. And of course, we all know that she was going to Thrive on the convention with some of the girls on her downline. And she was really struggling at this point. And this is the part that's hard for a lot of us to read and see how just broken she was because of how disgusting and cold Chris was being and what was being done to her, and then having the pregnancy and taking care of the girls on top of it. She was just exhausted and overwhelmed. And she thought about not going, but of course Chris didn't want her to cancel because he had an opportunity to spend time with Nicole. Around this time, Shanann's friends were telling her to find out if he was seeing someone else. And Chris says that later that month, she did start asking him quite frequently if there was someone else, if he was having an affair, and sometimes daily, several times. And he just kept denying it. And we all know with Chris's personality, he had no reason to admit to the affair because he was going to kill her. Why would he admit that to her when he knew that she was going to be dead soon? Chapter 8, there's really not much to it. It's called The Week Before, but it basically just talks about how he was having an affair and this darkness was growing inside of him. The only interesting thing that I really got out of this chapter was that even though we already know this was the first time that Chris ever admitted that the sole reason that he killed Shanann and the girls was just to start a new life with Nicole. Chapter 9 talks about the weekend of the murders. And as we know, Shanann left Friday the 10th really early in the morning to go to Arizona. And it's not in the book, but just to note it, she texted Chris after she had left and said that she was feeling dizzy again, was having trouble standing. It's our opinion that it's probably another day that he slipped her an oxy in her shake because she also thanks him for getting up with her that morning. But anyway, it starts talking about how the next day on Saturday, of course, Chris lets her know that he's hired a sitter and that he's going to go out with the guys and go see a game. We obviously know that he went on the date with Nicole to the Lazy Dog that Saturday night. He talks about how he ran out of the gift cards that he would use when he and Nicole would go on dates. And so, of course, he kind of said, screw it, I'm just going to use our personal debit card. and they spent $62 on the meal. He told Shanann that he had a salmon and a beer, which obviously that doesn't match up. And she got the alert and was immediately suspicious because she knew that was too much for one person. So Shanann started telling her friends about this, and she ended up looking up the Lazy Dogs menu online. She also looked up the score of the Rockies game that night, just to kind of, I'm sure, double check what he was saying. And at this point, I think it's clear to see that she's in a state of denial to a certain extent because she's got all of the flags there that there's an affair going on. But, very understandably, she just doesn't want to believe it. It's a really hard situation for her to be in. And on his end, he really doesn't give a crap at this point because he knows that he's going to kill her the next day. So it doesn't matter if he pisses her off about using their personal debit card. He doesn't care anymore. He's a free man in his mind. He's moved past it. He knows that he's going to kill them. So he doesn't have a care in the world. This next part is really interesting to me. And I have a degree in psychology, so the psychological aspect of this always is fascinating to me and in every case. And I also, in this case particularly, we're still trying to piece together these holes that he's leaving. And even after the third confession, he's still lying and he's still covering up a couple things. And there's always a reason for why he's doing that. And if you just have to look at the patterns of what he's dropped and kind of revealed about himself, and you can kind of figure out what it is. And this is a good example of that right here, because Chris says he never felt the emotion of anger until the morning of August 13th. He says that he went into a rage at the time of the murders and couldn't stop. And that was what's in his first confession. He finally admits to the author that day that he was not in a rage that morning, which obviously we know is much more in line with the premeditation that went on and the fact that you can track back in discovery at least 4 weeks of him taking steps to plan the murders. But he says that Shanann did make him angry, but when he killed her, he was not in a rage. And this is the part that I find really important, and I'll expand on this later in the next video, but I think it's an important point here. As he explains the murders today, he wasn't in a rage until he got to the oil fields. And I think after listening to all of this, it finally helped us kind of put everything in its place and give us a pretty good idea of actually what happened that night. Chapter 10 talks about Sunday, August 12th, 2018. And obviously we know from Discovery what happened that day, but it's interesting to get this perspective from Chris. He's still contradicting himself, but what really sticks out to me on this part is just how sick the way he describes his thought process that day. He recalls that Nicole was texting him a lot that day, telling him how bad she wanted him and she wanted to see him, and it was really keeping his mind on her. This is also the day she told investigators that she was at the museum with her family, and it was also the day that she exchanged all of those text messages with Charlotte, conveniently telling her the day before the murders about Chris and their relationship while simultaneously playing it down, which the whole text exchange there between her and Charlotte, in our opinion, seemed really contrived. Chris says that after they came home from the birthday party, he grilled some chicken breasts. He took that weird refrigerator temperature picture. He packed his lunch for the next day and cleaned the kitchen. He bathed the girls, read them bedtime stories, and put them down for the night. He then spent the next hour and a half or so talking on the phone with Nicole. So according to Chris, they had phone sex. So if you'll recall, Nicole has amnesia of this phone call 4 days after when investigators ask her about it. She just remembers that the TV was on in the background. She doesn't remember the content of the phone call, even though it was such an important night. Chris says in the February interview, I just listened to it again the other night, that they just basically talked about whatever and talked about their days. In this version now, 3.0, he says that they had phone sex. Still seems extremely fishy to me on a couple different levels. Obviously, there's something that they're hiding during that phone call. I mean, let's be realistic. If there wasn't anything to hide, why not just say, well, Shanann was coming home and we were talking about where do we go from here? But it just seems like they took a lot of steps to hide what they were talking about. Chris said that when he tucked the little girls into bed that night, he knew it would be the last time that he would tuck them in. Usually once they went to bed, they stayed in their beds and they went to sleep. They had had an early nap that day and a really busy day at the birthday party, so Chris figured they would just go to sleep and stay that way. However, for whatever reason, Bella kept getting out of bed, wanting to know when her mommy was going to be home. While he was on that 111-minute phone call with Nicole, Shanann texted him that her plane was delayed. She was originally supposed to get in at 10:30, which I think is important in the timeline that night. So she told him that it was going to be really late before she got home. And if you'll remember in Discovery, he acted really nonchalant when he got back to her, and he said something along the lines of, "Oh, well, that sucks." But actually, he was pretty disappointed and pissed off because he was ready to get this show on the road and didn't want to delay it anymore. In his words, he had finally got his nerve up. At the end of chapter 10, Chris says that the night before the murders, he knew the next morning was going to be the day that he would rid his life of his family. He thought it would free him to be with Nicole. Chapter 11 talks about the night of the murders. The author starts out by talking about what the weather was like in Colorado that day and how Shanann walked into her house for the last time. This is also the part where she shares the letter that was in Daily Mail that Chris wrote her on April 23rd, where he complains about the petition when people wanted to have his pictures taken away. And he also talks about God wanting him to confess and how he finally wants to come clean with the truth and tell her more things than he told the FBI, even though this version is still not the truth. He starts out by talking about this emotional conversation, and I'm using air quotes because not only do I not think that there was ever an emotional conversation, I don't think there was any conversation. And if you look at the content of what he says was that they said to each other, basically he just piecemeals things that they said to each other over the past 2 weeks. And you can see these things in the text. For instance, when they talk about moving to Brighton, that's something that they talked about a week ago. And she texted it to one of her friends. And different things like that you can pick out of the conversation about the compatibility. That's also something they talked about a week ago. And he's trying to fill in this fake emotional conversation. But anyway, back to what the author says. He says, 1 minute we would talk about downsizing the house and getting something more affordable in a more affordable town. And then he would go back to telling her that he was going to get his own apartment, make money on his own. And then she started crying. So it doesn't even make sense at this point what he's saying. She was saying that she didn't want to separate and that she loved him. And he basically hates so much that he told her back, "I don't love you. I'm not compatible with you anymore." And as she was crying with her mascara running down her face, she told me she couldn't make it in Colorado by herself with 3 kids. Isn't it weird how I look back and what I remember so much is her face getting all black with streaks of mascara? And again, I'm sure this was from another time when she was upset and crying to him about the whole situation. He goes on to say that this is the point when Shanann says that he's not going to see the girls anymore, and he becomes really angry, even though earlier in the book he admits that he wasn't in a rage when he killed her and that he had carefully planned this out. He says that when she started to get drowsy, he somehow knew how to squeeze the jugular veins until it cut off the blood flow to her brain, and she passed out. He actually makes the statement that it was even easier than the girls. He said she lay there and didn't fight back, and then he held the jugular for what seemed like a very long time, and then he watched his hands and just couldn't take them off of her because he knew that she was going to keep him from Nicole. He then goes on to say that they asked me why she didn't fight back, and it's because she couldn't fight back. Her eyes filled with blood, and she looked at me, and she died. I knew she was gone when she relieved herself. He says that as he was wrapping Shanann up in the bedsheet, both of the girls come walking into the room. And he says, I don't know how it could be possible, but they were both up and walking around. I knew if Nicole and I were going to be together, I had to kill all of them. He then says that he wrapped Shanann in the sheet and that Bella kept asking him what was wrong with Mommy, and that both girls were crying and looked like they had been through some trauma. And he says, I knew it was because of being smothered. It's a really odd thing to say. The whole thing is just really bizarre. You can tell that this is where he's covering something up because his stories get really weird when he's lying. He says, I could not comfort my girls. I had no desire to. I think I told her that Mommy would be okay. She just didn't feel good. And then he talks about how he tries to carry her down the stairs, like he said before, but she kept slipping out and she was too heavy and he kept dropping her. So he ended up just kind of dragging her down the stairs. He says the girls were just kind of running around the house and with really scared looks on their faces and that Bella was crying. He says, and I quote, "What a nightmare this was." So yeah, Chris, I'm sure it was pretty hard for them too. He goes on to say, "This is the reason I killed them first, so they did not have to witness any of this. I wanted to take them peacefully and make it so much easier for them and for me. Now I didn't know what I was going to do. I got Shanann down the stairs and laid her by the back door. I ran outside and backed my truck up the driveway. As I was moving my truck, I realized that everything I had thought about was about to be completed. And this part really gets me. He says, I was angry with the girls that they were up and awake, and I felt anger for Shanann that I could have killed anything that got in my way." He goes again through like the laundry list of stuff that he wanted to pack that day that we already heard when he was watching Nate's video, like his lunch, his shovel, his rake. And then he does say that he doesn't know why he took the gas can. He admits that he never had any plans to kill himself, like he told the FBI. He talks about how he drags Shanann out to the truck and then lifts her in the back, walks around to the other side, and kind of pulls her across the floor. And then he says, the stench of her relieving herself was so strong to that this day I can smell it and it makes me sick. Now, I'm not sure if it's the stench of her relieving herself or if it was the stench of death. He says he asked the girls to follow him out to the truck and that Bella had told him that they couldn't ride with him because they didn't have their car seats, and he told her that time it was okay. Then he says, it hurt, but I remember being so mad that they were still alive. The girls sat curled up with each other, and he said they were consoling each other and kind of whimpering, and all they kept talking about in the truck was, why did it stink so bad? He actually says next, I could not believe they came back to life. Now I had to deal with this for the second time, plus Shanann. He says that it took him over an hour to get to the site and that he hadn't calmed down at all. And as you'll remember earlier in the book, he said that he went into a rage when he got to the oil site. And then he kind of tries to do, well, you know the rest. He dumped Shanann on the ground and then he walked back to the truck with the blanket that Celeste was holding. He put it over her head and he smothered her. He says that he carried her up the stairs, opened the hatch, and that he was surprised how small the opening was. He lifted her up and down into the hole. He states that she went in pretty smoothly. He remembers that as he was lowering her body, he would never see her again. But instead of love he always had for her, he had complete numbness towards her and didn't feel anything towards her. He couldn't believe how easy it was just to let her drop through the hole and let her go. He describes hearing the splash as she hits the oil. He says that then he immediately went back to the truck and he went over to Bella. Bella asked him if he was going to do to her what he had just done to Celeste. He says that he doesn't think he answered her, and he put the same blanket over her head and smothered her. He says, I could not believe, though, how much of a fight she put up. Little quiet Bella had a will to live. Nothing registered in my head for her. Out of all three, Bella is the only one that put up a fight. I will hear her soft little voice for the rest of my life saying, Daddy, no. She knew what I was doing to her. She may not have understood death, but she knew I was killing her. So I apologize for this, guys. I know this is really a rough part of the book, and it's just disgusting how he describes this. He then goes on to say, I was so empowered at the time. I had the strength to climb those stairs for the second time and put her little body through the hole in the next tank. Bella was harder to get down the hole. Her arms and shoulders did not want to fit through the hole, so I had to force her through the hatch. They told me they found a tuft of blonde hair. I would suspect that's when that happened. I did separate them purposely. I was trying to get them as far away from Shanann as possible. I guess I put them in the tanks to make sure this time they didn't get up. He then talks about how he went and dug a hole for Shanann, and he talks about how the dirt was loose, and he remembers it being really easy to dig the hole, and he thought it seemed a lot deeper than it was. And he says as he pulled on the sheet and she rolled out into the hole, I think she had given birth, which another bizarre lie. So she landed face down. He says, I remember being so angry with her that I wasn't going to change how she landed. I didn't think about if the hole was deep enough, or if I had the hole in the right place, or if I had made sure to pick everything up so there was nothing left lying around. I realized I had just murdered my daughters twice. I still don't understand how that happened, because I know they were dead the first time. He says that after he had done all that, all he could feel now was that he was free to be with Nicole. Instead of feeling any remorse for anything he had done, he just felt feelings of love for her, and they were overcoming him. I felt no remorse, he says. The darkness inside of me had won. It was still in me, though, I thought, maybe permanently. I felt evil swallowed up by this thing inside me. I felt like I could kill anything and be justified for doing it. I just didn't feel any remorse for what I did. I didn't feel bad for killing my entire family. I really didn't feel anything. My mind went to the dog. Did I remember to put him in the cage? After Chris killed his family and drove away, he claims that Nicole texted him to look up the song by Metallica called Battery. We have no proof that she did this from what I've seen, but that's what he's claiming. She ends the chapter by just talking about how Chris had gone back to work that day, just like any other day, and that when his coworkers were interviewed, they said he was completely normal and they didn't notice anything about him at all except for his clothes, but his demeanor was the same as it is every day. Thanks for listening to part 2 of our Letters from Christopher discussion. We'll have part 3 from chapter 12 to the end of the book shortly. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel.